Useless Monster by Mute Crows, Chapter 26. Even with the self-reassurance that he had done well, his pulse was still racing. He wouldn't pull out now just because his anxiety was getting to him. He locked his eyes on the screen as he watched the numbers come in for each placement ranking. Apparently, only 42 would be allowed into the second round. That was both more and less than he had expected, depending on how he had approached concepts of a second round. He crossed his arms loosely and tapped a finger on his arm steadily, trying to recall the pace Yagi had used months back. Even as all the students arrived and the announcements were made to begin the second round, he stayed locked on the screen. A cavalry battle. Midnight confidently stated all the rules and gestured to the auxiliary images that accompanied her monologue, and Izuku kept tapping. He could do this and be fine. It was fine. She announced the point rankings from low to high, everyone taking in the information quietly until she got the first place. 10 million! The reveal delighted Bakugo, struck the crowd silent, if only for a moment, and drew the direct, focused intent of every other student still in the field. The relief that washed over Izuku was indescribable. He had no idea what he would have done if he actually had gotten first place with that big of a follow-up target. Even still, he thought he had the second highest point assignment. With the points of the group accumulating, he would probably have to find partners lower in the ranks. As he scanned over the crowd, he watched the way different people flocked to either Todoroki or Bakugo. There were those circling around him as well, but he paid them little mind. He understood the idea they were holding, but it was a dangerous route to go for the absolute biggest numbers, since it would mean other teams would undoubtedly be after you. It was much better to play it safe initially. He would try to build a team that placed their starting points at a little above the middle of the crowd. Uraraka bounced over to him with a grin, happily declaring them a team, and asked who Izuku had in mind for them to partner with. A glance around, and he smiled as he raised a hand to wave.
Not sure what you plan on having me do, or if you're just going for friends here, Midoriya.
Shinso gave him a grin as well as he got into a reasonable distance for not raising his voice too much, pushing through the crowd.
Trust me on this!
Izuku scratched at his jaw as he looked around more.
Well, of course.
Shinso bumped him gently with his arm as he looked around the teams that were being built.
You've got a good enough head on your shoulders. I think this is the most fun I've had all week. Uraraka, did you see him jumping across everyone when the race started?
Students started to disperse from around him as they realized he wasn't going to just be badgered into grouping up with any student. What? No, I didn't! I was too busy trying to get through the crowd myself! She bounced in place as she started to ask Shinso what position he would like on the team so far. As they spoke, Izuku noticed exactly what he needed. A glance at his two friends got him a nod to show they saw he was going to be stepping away. He hurried over and tapped the girl's shoulder as she pouted about being brushed off by Bakugo.
Hey, You came in second, which is close enough for me!
She spun towards him with a predatory but excited look. Quite frankly, it was much more energy than he had expected from her.
Yes! I was wondering if you would like to join me? On my team?
He was suddenly unsure. She was exactly what they needed. Having been second to last in the initial rankings gave her a low point count, but given the gear she had on, she was likely a support class student. He had heard Aizawa complaining about processing speed for Aoyama's belt a few days back to Yamada on the balcony. She would have had clearance to use her items, and that meant her team would be able to as well. It would be a major bonus if he could get her.
Yes, you will love my babies! Hurry, we need to get my babies selected and secured to truly be seen by the crowd!
She grabbed him by the shoulders and started to push him back towards Uraraka and Shinso. Her grip dug in just a little too much, and he felt the way his heart stuttered at the pressure. It wasn't grounding, it just made him way too aware of his body.
Hey, let off of him.
Shinso was giving the girl a glare. He must have heard the quiet sounds Izuku was making as he was shoved into their presence once more.
Yeah, Tucker doesn't like being grabbed like that by people.
Uraraka grabbed the girl's wrists and pulled them off of his shoulders.
How's day? Let's get my babies out and get suited up, okay? We can use any of the ones I got permission for.
Hatsume gave a blinding smile and looked them all over with calculating eyes.
I should have things that will fit all of you.
Okay, well, first we have to get our plan worked out, which I assume you already have mostly worked out, Midoriya.
He had gone back to his usual bored look, but was clearly keeping at least his visual focus on Hatsune. She ran off quickly, though, presumably to grab her
Babies.
that she was so excited for. I was thinking we use the fact that our collective points aren't anything too major to steal a few of the other small team headbands. We don't need to be in second or first, just in the top 3 to be safe. Whatever they have planned for the final game, I don't think they would hack it down to just 8 students that fast. The festival would be over too soon if they did, he reasoned.
Alright, so we have to keep an eye on the scoreboard once preparation ends, and then go for all we can that are low?
Rebecca clapped her hands together and pointed towards him with them.
Sort of. We don't need a ton to get into the top 3. There will be at least 10 teams, so we will probably only need 2 or 3 of the other headbands to get into the final round.
We are gonna go offensive then.
Shinzo rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the stands, brows furrowed in thought.
We are gonna be targeted too, obviously, but to get the 2 or 3 bands, we will have to go offensive first.
I mean, the white hat of all of this is going to be Bakugo's group with the 10 million.
The what?
Izuku's thoughts pulled up at the phrase and turned to her in utter confusion.
The white heart? Did you not research a bunch of old hero names when you were younger? It's a white deer that was apparently, impossible to catch. It was a Western thing.
She waved a hand in front of her reddening face.
It's not important. Continue.
Okay, first and foremost, we are gonna want reach, since none of us have long distance or even mid-range offensive quirks. So I was thinking we have Shinso as the rider, since he is the tallest of us. He can also use his quirk to get the other riders to stall long enough for us to get a grab in.
Izuku started to lay out his thoughts, looking down at his own hands as he worked it over.
Once people get that figured out, though, we wouldn't be able to use it again if they steal their headbands back.
He countered.
We can all try and do things to make it hard to tell what caused the quirk effect, and then you drop it as soon as we are out of reach so they don't know if it is an area of affecting or not.
Here,
Hatsune dropped multiple large cases onto the dirt right next to them.
all of my babies we could possibly use for whatever you have planned.
If you had stayed a moment, you would have...
I have so many that you would love to use. Here,
She plowed right over Shinzo and opened one of the many identical boxes.
these help with...
We only need things that will help with staying agile. Things for quick getaways that we can recover from just as fast to stay with the upper hand.
Izuku interrupted her before she could start to info-dump about each device. They only had so long to prepare.
I am the perfect baby for that.
She shuffled through the boxes before pulling one out specifically.
I was also thinking that I could take the lead on the horses, so that way Araraka can easily use her quirk on all 3 of us if need be.
He finished the plan he had worked out with a questioning look in her direction.
Leave it to me, Deku.
She gave him a thumbs up and determined grin. They all finally turned to Hatsune, who was still going on about the 5th item that she has now set out, apparently having not noticed in the least that they had been ignoring her in favor of planning. Izuku looked over the gear and nodded before crouching down to be on level with her as she continued her explanations. The gear was selected, and they went to midnight to announce their team and get their headband. Shinso tied it, accidentally unfastening the Velcro breakaway the first 2 tries before he groaned, left the Velcro undone, tied it in front of him, and then latched it. They were putting on the support gear from Hatsune as she went over exactly how they worked again. Shinso looked unsure about having a jetpack on, but Izuku was greatly enjoying having the leg bracers. They took off a lot of the strain he had been feeling from having run so much lately. It was likely something they had factored into the festival, the way that each game would wear down the students participating. They lifted Shinso in one motion. The boy was lighter than Izuku had expected, but that was more of a benefit for him and the rest of the team. They moved to a clearing in the field and watched the timer start to count down. He swallowed his nerves down and readjusted his grip. A hand buried itself in his hair and he looked up at Shinso, who pointedly wasn't looking at him. He instead was searching the nearby teams with a determined yet bored look. His hand patted him gently, and Izuku felt how his heart stopped its panicked pace. "It's just a game. We all know these are just games. Mike shouted the excited start in time with the buzzer, and every team was immediately in motion. Most were going for Bakugo and his team, a few for Todoroki and himself, and some just stalled to see the playing field. His mind stumbled to keep up, and he realized that maybe he wasn't exactly ready to try and run this group right now. His skin was buzzing distantly, and he was beginning to get the feeling it wasn't just his nerves anymore. Great!
Midoriya,
He hummed loudly to Shinso.
do you trust your plan? Do you trust me?
His fingers pet through his hair again, as if he could feel the energy thrumming through Izuku just by doing so. It was a much more loaded question than he thought Shinso was aware of. He took a breath as he watched how one of the smaller teams was rushing them head-on. There were more approaching from other directions, too.
Yes!
And he was beside himself. The sensations that his quirk usually fed him, the all-encompassing aches and pains that were all around him, were dunked underwater. Distant. It was a relief to feel how his heart instantly dropped down to a resting rate as Shinso told him to move left, and his body followed without hesitation. A few more commands, and they were sufficiently out in the middle of the surrounding charge they had been facing. He could tell people had lost interest pretty fast as more started to target Bakugo directly. The loud explosions of him fending off the crowd of students wanting to get the 10 million didn't even faze him. He would laugh if he could. And then he was back to himself, the rush of the aches flooding back into full spectrum as Shinso dropped his hold. He guessed the breath and felt the way a team was approaching from behind.
Oh, Rebecca, we gotta jump!
He twisted his head in the direction of the team charging them. Their band count was low, so dodging them for now wouldn't hurt them too badly. He felt how his body became weightless, the sensation still just as odd as the first time he had felt it weeks ago. The jetpack kicking on launched them high out of reach, and Hatsume was screaming praises for her baby as it performed exactly how it was meant to. The crowd went wild as ice shot in a semicircle around part of the field. It wouldn't have needed much thought to know it was Todoroki cutting off the rest of the cavalries from getting to Bakugo. The competitive drive of his classmates went without saying by now, and he could see where that drive petered out with some of the groups either playing purely defensive or just barely holding enough cohesion to get the offensive working well regardless. When their feet all finally hit the ground, cushioned by both Uraraka's quirk and Hatsume's boots she had equipped them with, Izuku finally felt some of the previous excited laughter return. The girl was loudly applauding her creation still, and her laughter blended in with his comfortably.
Better now?
Shinso's hand returned to pat him once.
Yeah, sorry.
He started to run towards a group that wasn't facing them.
Don't worry about it, thank you.
How many bands do we have now?
Izuku turned them to run tangent to the other rider, Shinso reaching out and nabbing the band just barely with his fingers as they blew past the group. They shouted in frustration as Izuku called for the girls to turn on the hover boot things they were wearing, and he pushed to run faster, the bracers adding some extra force to each of his strides until they were safely out of range.
That makes 3 total. I don't think you were really paying attention when I grabbed the first one in the initial rush,
Shinso said as he secured the band around his head with the other 2.
And where does that put us? I can't see around Shinso.
Uraraka wobbled a bit as Izuku slowed enough for the rear horses to start running again themselves. He looked up to the board.
We have 1,030 points right now, and that has us in 3rd. We only have a minute left. You guys want to go for a 4th tag that'll put us in 2nd, or play safe and go on defensive for the rest of this?
He asked as he noticed one of the bandless cavalry groups charging them.
We need to show up my babies more. I think we will be fine.
Uraraka interrupted Hatsume quickly, but was sure to continue her reasoning to the other.
Getting to the 3rd round of games means more showtime for your babies.
Yeah, we can stay up and keep an eye on the board.
Shinso called out a taunt to the front horse of another group, and when they replied, he grinned as he took hold of the kid just long enough to make the rest of the team trip over him. Their near wipeout distracted them long enough for Izuku to guide them away to a more empty part of the field. It didn't take much longer for the round to end. The final buzzer going off in time with a massive explosion and shattering of ice. The moisture of the melted ice flew in every direction. Mist covered that part of the field long enough for Izuku to crouch down just so and let Shinso off of his carriage. He rolled his sore shoulders and watched with the rest of the students as the mist cleared to reveal Bakugo still smugly wearing his 10 million at some point headband. He looked away with a sneer and started towards the more grassy part of the field where they had been gathering before the round. He only stopped when Hatsume called out unhappily about him taking one of her babies. Right, the bracers. She raced to take them off of him, asking countless questions but never stopping long enough for him to answer. He didn't mind, since he probably wouldn't have answered anyways. He looked at how the listings left Bakugo at the top of the rankings and the crowd's wild praises he's showing so far. It made him feel sick. The buzz under his skin felt fuzzy and unpleasant. Even as Midnight called out the 4 groups that would be going through, he felt sick. Bakugo, Todoroki, Shinso, and Tetsu. He could feel someone specifically watching him again, though, and he didn't mean the crowd. When he looked around, he saw Todoroki once again staring him down with a look he couldn't pick apart very well. The break in the festival was called. It was a time for recuperation and eating before the final set of games. He stayed where he was, holding Todoroki's gaze long enough for him to hopefully get the silent message. Just tell me what you want. I don't understand. Two-toned eyes swept away from him, and he started to walk towards the gates to leave the field with his hands in his pockets. Izuku made sure to follow. They meandered the halls enough to get to a gate out of the stadium that was far from the stalls and booths at the main entrance. Todoroki turned and leaned against one wall. Izuku mirrored him with a curious look. The silence between them felt incredibly charged, but he wasn't sure how much of that was just him or was actually there. Even as a minute ticked by, 2, maybe even 3, neither spoke. Izuku searched him with his quirk. There was nothing too out of the ordinary. Even the usual low-level bruises were gone. There was just the ache of being far too cold for too long and steady quirk usage.
Why has so much of the staff focused on you?
Todoroki's voice was low, quiet, as if he was mostly speaking to himself. He just furrowed his brow in confusion. Was it that obvious?
You aren't some famous person's child, at least not as far as I have been able to find. It has gotten more evident since USJ as well.
Izuku swallowed and bit on his tongue carefully.
I don't recall you being anywhere major, though. Yet you were in the medical ward for much longer than anyone else. They even blocked your friends from going to visit.
They tried to visit?
In fact, he continued, they didn't let anyone in that entire wing of the school until after you got released. The police hadn't even been allowed in.
He didn't sound accusatory about anything, just cautiously curious. Izuku didn't respond, still trying to puzzle out what Todoroki was going for.
Even All Might shows a degree of actual sincerity when interacting with you versus with any of the other students in our class. He clearly is trying to be impartial, but are you just playing observation games, Todoroki?
He cut him off, something about the direction this was going and making him feel uncomfortably exposed.
What? You know what my quirk is, right? Baton pass?
Todoroki looked briefly confused before the feeling left his gaze.
It lets me locate, feel, and determine the degree of physical damage on other people. I can sense and take injuries. I have had a lot of practice.
Izuku crosses his arms in front of himself protectively.
I have wandered through less savory parts of town a number of times. Enough times to know what bruising from fights or accidents or abuse feels like.
Todoroki narrowed his eyes, body tensing just so.
You come to school quite often with bruising or even overstrained quirk use.
Izuku left it there. His point had been sufficiently made. Todoroki's glare sharpened. Their silence was a stalemate that Izuku was fine to leave as is. Then he huffed out a frustrated breath.
A trade of information, then.
You want to know that badly? Izuku didn't say anything, yet not curious himself how far Todoroki was willing to go to get his answers. Then he started his story. A tale of an arranged quirk marriage, of failed children and abuse, of the point where a person finally broke. Izuku didn't say a word the entire time. He knew about these kinds of deals. There had been a time or two he had dropped a newborn off at a hospital that he had found in a dumpster. He never forgot the odd weight of them under his neck, carefully tucked into the warm fur there and supported by many points. It shouldn't surprise him as much as it did that the issue went so far up the social ladder. Abuse was everywhere. Todoroki paused for a moment, voice catching slightly before he started to talk of his mother, the source of his scar, if all the previous implications held true. Just as the words started to come forth, Izuku felt an all too familiar strain in his forearms approaching, and fast.
How much would you like to keep your trauma secret, Todoroki?
His interruption earned him a pissed-off glare. Izuku tilted his head slightly back the way they had come, and the look morphed into mild confusion.
Bakugo is coming this way!
They both stood silent until they could actually faintly hear the distant stomping footsteps of the boy in question.
You said an exchange?
He whispered. Todoroki nodded.
We can finish later.
He turned to leave the stadium, but stopped when Todoroki spoke up.
And how do I know we will?
Izuku thought about that. Todoroki had no reason to trust him. There was nothing Izuku could give him to establish that trust either, and Todoroki had already divulged much of his part of the trade before they were interrupted. It would have to be done blind.
You don't. But I have nothing to lose or gain from this exchange, so I have no reason not to.
They looked at each other. The footsteps got louder. Todoroki grumbled and walked past Izuku to get outside. After a moment, Izuku followed. They walked in silence towards the cafeteria.
Do you want to eat lunch with us?
Izuku watched the way Todoroki stumbled slightly at that. It was a blink and you miss it kind of movement, but it had happened. The question couldn't have been that strange, so it must have just been that Todoroki hadn't actually been invited to eat with any of the other students yet. He looked away to let Todoroki mull it over in their shared silence.
Okay,